The first time my stepdaughter jabbed her finger into my chest, she told me the restaurant business had passed me by years ago. The second time, she said I'd been dead weight on the brand since the day I let her put her name on the door. The third time, with 60 of my oldest customers and half the local food press watching from their seats, she said, "You're a leech," just like Dad was. Her husband Derek stood off to the side with his phone up, filming in that slow, satisfied way people film things they've been waiting to post. This was supposed to be two things at once that night: my 60th birthday and the launch gala for Renee's solo concept. My stepdaughter had spent a year telling every reporter in the city she'd built entirely on her own, out of nothing. No help from anyone. I stood there in my own dining room, under a ceiling I'd hung the lights for myself 20 years earlier, and let her finish. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't grab her wrist. I looked at the woman I'd taught to crack eggs one-handed when she was 6 years old, back when her real father was already gone and had left nothing behind but a stack of unpaid bills, and I let the silence answer for me. She had no idea the liquor license hanging behind the bar still had my name on it. She had no idea the trademark on Renee's, the one printed on every menu, every tote bag, every investor deck she'd shown that week, had never actually been transferred out of my company. She had no idea that in about 6 hours, none of that was going to matter to her anymore, because I was done being the part of her story she'd decided to erase. I'm Walter, 60 years old. If you want to watch someone find out exactly whose name was really on the door the whole time, type "closed" in the comments and subscribe before we get started. The gala kept moving around us the way these things always do. Nobody wants to be the one who stops smiling first. A few of the old regulars caught my eye with that particular look people give you when they've just watched something they wish they hadn't. Renee was still shaking with the kind of anger that only shows up when you're not as sure of yourself as you're pretending to be. 2 days before, she'd asked me to sign the trademark and the lease over to her outright, free and clear before the gala, so she could stand in front of investors as the sole owner of record. I told her I needed a week to look at the books first. I didn't need a week. I needed one afternoon. Her kitchen manager, Alonzo, had worked for me for 22 years before I sent him over to help her open Renee's. He came to my office 2 days before the party, not to complain, but because he didn't know who else to tell. She was planning to fire the entire original kitchen staff the morning after the gala, line cooks who'd been with me since before she could reach the stove, to make room for a brand, and the supplier credit lines under my company's name. The ones I'd co-signed as a favor when she opened were $85,000 past due, money that had gone somewhere other than food and wine. I walked out of my own party that night without a coat. The valet had my truck pulled around before I even asked. I didn't look back at the lights. I drove to the original restaurant, the one I built with my hands before Renee could walk, let myself into the back office, and sat down under one lamp with the real ledgers in front of me. 25 years of teaching someone to cook, to run a floor, to read a room. I'd handed her a lit stove, and somehow she'd convinced herself the flame had always been hers. It hadn't. I'd lit it, and I intended to remind her exactly whose match it was. My phone buzzed. She'd already posted the video from the party. Derek's footage, cut clean before her first jab, captioned "cutting ties with anyone who doesn't believe in my vision, even family. No regrets." 200,000 views in an hour. Strangers in the comments calling her fearless. Somewhere around midnight, sitting under that one lamp, I did something I don't usually do. I read the comments under her video. Most of them were noise, but one, buried a few hundred deep, 12 likes, no replies, I've thought about every day since. It said, "Notice how people who built it all alone always have someone specific in mind when they say it. You don't erase a stranger. You only erase the person whose fingerprints are still on everything you own." 12 likes. 200,000 people watched her cut me out of the story, and 12 of them saw the scar where I used to be. If you've ever been the fingerprint someone scrubbed off their success story, tell me about it in the comments. I have a feeling I'm in good company at this table. I made 3 calls before midnight. The first was to my attorney to file the paperwork revoking Renee's use of the trademark, effective immediately. The lease and the name had never left my company, and I'd simply never told her that the transfer she thought she was waiting on had quietly stalled in a drawer for a year. The second was to my produce distributor, a man I'd bought vegetables from for 2 decades, letting him know the credit line under my company's name was frozen pending an audit. No new deliveries until it cleared. The third was to my liquor wholesaler, with the same message. Then I opened the compliance portal and requested an expedited license review. A routine inspection, the kind that happens eventually to every restaurant, except I made sure it landed the next morning, during the gala's lunch service, when every investor and every food writer in the city would be sitting at Renee's tables watching it happen. I wasn't angry when I did any of it. Anger burns hot and fast. What I felt that night burned low and patient, the way a good fire is supposed to. Let me tell you something 25 years of kitchens taught me, because it's the reason I never raised my voice at that party. In a restaurant, the loudest station is always the one in trouble. A kitchen running right is almost silent. Every pan where it belongs, every ticket moving, nobody shouting because nobody needs to. The people screaming are the ones who've lost control of their station. It works the same way outside the kitchen. Renee jabbed her finger into my chest 3 times in front of 60 people because volume was all she had left. The license, the lease, the name, none of it was actually hers, and somewhere underneath the anger, I think she knew. The person who owns the room never has to announce it. They just have to decide when service ends. I decided at 11:47 that night. Noon the next day, the dining room at Renee's was full. Investors from a fund called Ashgrove Partners, 3 food critics, a dozen influencers with their phones already out. Derek was mid-pour on a bottle of 98 Barolo he'd told everyone was the crown jewel of the wine list, a bottle he'd quietly consigned to himself from an unrelated collector months earlier without telling anyone where the money for it had actually come from. The produce delivery never showed. Then the liquor rep called the front desk loud enough for the room to half hear, asking why an $85,000 balance was still open on an account he'd been told was current. Renee excused herself to take the call and came back paler than she'd walked in. 15 minutes later, a city compliance officer walked through the door with a clipboard and a very calm voice, asking to see the paperwork behind the name on the liquor license, the name on the lease, and the name on the trademark filed with the investor deck sitting open on the host stand. None of the 3 matched what Ashgrove Partners had been told in writing. The gala didn't end so much as it deflated. If you're still at the table with me, drop your city in the comments below. I read every one of them. Across town that same hour, Derek was at Halloran's, a small, serious auction house that handled rare wine, trying to quietly liquidate the personal collection he'd been planning to use to cover the supplier debt before anyone noticed it was missing. Halloran's authenticator spent 20 minutes with a loop and a UV light over 4 of his bottles before setting them down without a word and picking up the phone instead. The labels were real. The wine inside wasn't. Word in that world moves fast and quiet, the way it does in any small community built on trust. By that evening, 3 separate collectors had already called to ask Derek where exactly those bottles had come from. They arrived at the restaurant within the hour of each other, Renee and Derek, meeting at a door that was now taped shut with a compliance notice and a padlock the city had installed after the inspection turned up 3 code violations serious enough to close the kitchen on the spot. Alonzo and the rest of the original staff stood outside on the sidewalk with their aprons still on. I'd called each of them personally that morning and offered them their old stations back, effective immediately, at my place. Every one of them said yes before I finished the sentence. Renee stood on the sidewalk of a restaurant with her name on the window and no way to get inside it. That's when a car none of us recognized pulled up, and the 2 men who got out of it weren't from the city. They were collectors, the kind who buy and sell rare bottles the way other people trade stocks, and they'd been the ones who sold Derek the forged Barolo in the first place through a broker neither of them had ever met face to face. Now that Halloran's had flagged the bottles publicly, the whole chain of custody led straight back to Derek's name. And these 2 men had a very specific, very quiet interest in making sure nobody traced it any further than him. They told him, evenly, that his name was about to appear in an ongoing fraud investigation into counterfeit wine sales across 4 states, and that he'd be wise to have a very good story ready for the people who'd ask him about it. Then they got back in the car and left him standing there, ash white, on a sidewalk in front of his own padlocked restaurant. Renee turned to him and asked very quietly where the $85,000 had actually gone. He didn't have an answer that made either of their faces look any better. She had one option left that made any sense to her, and it was the same instinct that had gotten her every step she'd taken since she was small. Go back to the source. She remembered that I kept the original ownership file for Renee's, along with every signed statement from the staff about what she'd planned to do to them, locked in the office safe at my flagship restaurant. If she could get that file and destroy it, she thought, the mess might still be arguable in her favor. Ownership records lost, staff testimony gone, just her word against mine. She let herself in through the delivery entrance a little after midnight, a crowbar from Derek's garage in one hand. She didn't turn on the lights. She found the safe behind the framed photo of the day I opened my first restaurant, the one she used to point at as a kid and say she'd own a place just like it one day. She worked the dial from memory. It clicked open easily, because I'd wanted it to. Inside, there was no file, just one index card, sitting alone in the center of the safe, 4 words written on it in my handwriting. The kitchen's closed, Renee. The small red light above the safe had been blinking the whole time, feeding straight to my phone, a silent alarm I'd had installed years ago, back when the restaurant carried more cash on hand, went out to the alarm company and the police at the same moment she opened that door. She didn't even make it out through the delivery entrance before the first patrol car pulled into the alley. At trial, the footage from the birthday party played first. 3 jabs, 1 camera phone, 1 very specific sentence about a leech. Then the safe footage, the crowbar, the index card held up as evidence. Renée was convicted of breaking and entering with intent to destroy evidence, on top of separate labor violations uncovered once the fired kitchen staff gave statements about what she'd planned to do to them. Derek was indicted separately in the multi-state counterfeit wine investigation, his name surfacing as a distributor who should have known exactly what he was selling. 4 years for him, 5 for her. There's one thing I never told either of them, and I'm only telling you now. Renée's real father, the one she compared me to that night, once worked a line at my very first restaurant, back before either of them were born to me in any sense that mattered. I fired him myself 28 years ago for skimming out of the till 3 nights running. I never told her that. Some things a person has to find out is in their blood on their own, or not at all. I reopened the original dining room 2 weeks after the trial. Alonzo runs the kitchen now, full partner, name on the door alongside mine. What's left of the money that would have gone to Renée is funding 4 culinary apprenticeships a year for kids from families that can't afford the tuition. The kind of kid who grows up learning to crack an egg one-handed because somebody finally took the time to show them how. People think patience is the same thing as loyalty. It isn't. 25 years of covering for someone isn't love if you never ask what they're doing with it. Ask, or eventually you'll be the one standing outside, watching someone else's name burn where yours used to be. Thanks for visualizing with me for this one. If it got you, you know what to do below. See you in the next story.